we're going to start this hour with some breaking news. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer is to rewrite the government's fiscal rules in next week's budget to allow her to increase borrowing for public investment spending. Rachel Reeves is currently in Washington for a meeting of the International Monetary Fund and has been speaking to Sky News. Let's bring in our business economics correspondent, Paul Kelso, for more on this. Paul, great to have you with us. So the rules are going to change.
They are. Been lots of speculation about how on earth Rachel Reeves was going to marry the competing aims and demands, or apparently competing aims, of this budget to rebuild the public finances and deliver growth through investment. How can you possibly do that when you are bound in by commitments on how much you'll raise in tax, but particularly what's called the fiscal rules? Fiscal, that means tax and spend. How much you can borrow over a given economic cycle. They're self-imposed rules that governments use essentially to send a signal to international markets about the credibility and security of the UK as a country in which to invest. And they've been very, very tight. Now, in opposition, Rachel Reeves said she would stick to the rules the Conservatives have bequeathed her. She's now saying she will rewrite one of the two rules. First rule is you should all day-to-day spending on NHS and other public services should be covered by tax revenues, but she'll rewrite the second one using a different measure of public debt. So she gives herself more room potentially to borrow to invest, up to £50 billion more. Now, she set this out in an interview I've done with her this morning at the US Ambassador's residence here in Washington, where the Chancellor used to be based. And we can hear her now set out the rationale for this big, big change ahead of her budget.
I'll be setting out two fiscal rules at the budget. The first, the stability rule, that day-to-day spending will be funded through tax receipts. That's something the previous government never achieved, and it's something that is so important for the sustainability of the public finances. The second rule will be the investment rule, which will be to get debt down as a share of GDP. But I can confirm today that we will be measuring debt differently. I'll set out the details to the House of Commons at the budget next week. But the reason we're doing that is because there are massive opportunities to invest in Britain and to get the growth and the jobs of the future here for the UK. And I'm determined to do that. But it's not possible under the current rules. And so I've listened to what the IMF have been saying, but also UK economists like Gus O'Donnell and Andy Haldane and Jim O'Neill, who are all saying you need to free up money for investment. And so I can confirm that we will be measuring debt differently so that we can free up that money to invest.
Can you tell us how you will change that rule, or perhaps more usefully, how much you might be able to borrow more as a consequence?
I'll set out all those details to the House of Commons when I deliver the budget next week. But under the plans that I've inherited from the previous Conservative government, public sector net investment as a share of our economy was due to decline steeply during the course of this Parliament. And if we carried on that path, it would be a path of decline. And I don't want that path for Britain when there are so many opportunities in industries from life sciences to carbon capture and storage and clean energy to AI and technology, as well as the need to repair our crumbling schools and hospitals. So we will measure debt differently, but of course we'll put guardrails in place to ensure that every pound of taxpayers' money spent is spent wisely, and will involve the National Audit Office and the Office for Budget Responsibility in that.
I mean, you know your critics are going to say you painted yourself into a corner with your tax pledges to get in office. Now you're fiddling the rules to give yourself some headroom.
Well, the rule that really bites is the first rule, the stability rule, to get day-to-day spending funded by tax receipts. That's something that the previous government weren't even trying to achieve, and we will show in the budget next week how we will deliver on that promise. The second rule is about being responsible by seizing the opportunities, but doing it in a way where we're making sure we're getting value for money for every pound of taxpayers' money spent. But there's a debate to be had, and there's a divide, I think, in politics today about whether you're on the side of investment and that's where I am with our investment rule, or whether you're happy to see Britain go on a path of decline. And if the Conservatives and others oppose the changes to the fiscal rules and the investment rule next week, they have to accept that those investment opportunities in digital, in transport, in low-carbon energy, where Britain has a real chance to lead the world, if they don't support the changes to that investment rule, then they're accepting that path of decline.
The IMF has supported public investment this week, the wind is blowing in that direction. You've cited some domestic advocates of that. Do you think the markets, though, you'll have the confidence of the markets to borrow that money without consequences that we've seen only 2 years ago?
Well, we'll make sure that we've got sufficient headroom in meeting our targets. That's really important. But markets will also want to know what the money is being used for. And if you continue to borrow just to fund day-to-day spending, I don't think the markets do think that that is a good idea. But if you are borrowing to invest in things that will deliver a return for our country and a return for taxpayers, that's a very different scenario, which is why it's also important that alongside the investment rule and being very clear that borrowing is only to pay for investment, that we have guardrails around what we can invest in. And that's why we'll be making sure that the National Audit Office and the OBR are brought into evaluating to ensure that we're getting good value for money and a return for taxpayers.
Presumably one way you retain the confidence of markets and meet your first fiscal rule is to hit people in their pockets. You're going to have to tax them more and you're going to have to make spending cuts. Just one, national insurance on pensions, employer pension payments. If you introduce that, are you going to exempt the public sector so the private sector has to bear it all?
I was clear in the statement I made to the House of Commons in July that there will be difficult decisions in this budget around spending, welfare and taxation. But the precise details I will set out to the House of Commons next week. The worst thing that a Chancellor could do in the budget next week is not put Britain's public finances and Britain's public services on a sustainable path. I'm determined to do that. I will be a responsible Chancellor. I will be honest and transparent about the challenges we face, but also how we'll fix them to wipe the slate clean after the mismanagement we've seen the last few years under the Conservatives, ensure that our sums add up and free up money to invest so that we can grow our economy, bring good jobs and investment to Britain.
Okay, finally, if I may, just briefly, we talked a lot about what economists think, what the markets think, what businesses think. What would you like an individual, a consumer, a household, ordinary person who may be someone who's voted Labour for the first time or for the first time in a while, what do you want them to think of your budget when you sit down on Wednesday?
That I've done everything in my power to protect ordinary working people, that we're beginning to fix our National Health Service, and that we're beginning to rebuild our country, fixing the foundations to seize the enormous opportunities that I can see are out there and we must grasp together as a country.